Well, a verse that we have read together in Ephesians 1 verse 7, it tells us, in him, that is Jesus, in him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins according to the riches of his grace. Well, we're going to be looking today at Jesus as our kinsman redeemer. And I'm sure there are some of us here who understand what a kinsman redeemer was, but there may be those of us here who do not know what a kinsman redeemer is. And so we come back to the Old Testament, and in Leviticus and chapter 25 and verse 25, God gives a loving command to the people. Now, the context of this command is that all the land which was about to be given to the Israelites, all that land belonged to God. And it was an inheritance that the people would have. And because all the land which the people had belonged to God, it meant that there was no permanent selling of the land. In verse 23, he tells the people that the land is mine. And so in Leviticus 25 and verse 25, this command is made. If one of your brethren becomes poor and has sold some of his possession, and if his redeeming relative comes to redeem it, then he may redeem what his brother sold. What we see is a person who is down on their luck, either through making bad decisions or through extenuating circumstances. They have lost and had to sell part of their inheritance that God had given to their forefathers. Now, this is before they had gone into the land. Okay, and so this is a promise to the generations who would come. God was telling Moses, this is what is going to be a law in the society of Israel, that if you have to sell your land, that a redeeming relative can come and redeem it. If the very worst came, a person might have to sell themselves into slavery. Their debts are too great, and the land they have won't cover it. And so the very worst, a person has to sell themselves into slavery. But again, in verse 49, we read that this redemption might be for them again. They might be redeemed by, verse 49 tells us, anyone who is near of kin to him in his family may redeem him. So here we have the people of Israel, that if the worst has come to worse, and they've had to sell their land, and they've even had to sell themselves, that a close relative might come and buy them back. Well, the backdrop of all of this is the redemption which Israel has just received from Egypt. God promised the Israelites in Exodus chapter 6 and verse 6, I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will rescue you from their bondage, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who brings you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. And I will bring you into the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and I will give it to you as a heritage. I am the Lord. Well, this is what the Lord promised Moses to tell the people, I will redeem you. At that time, the people were in bondage in Egypt. They were slaves to the Pharaoh there. And we know the Exodus story. We know what happened next, how God then redeemed the people. That Moses went and spoke through Aaron, and Aaron said to Pharaoh, let my people go. And Pharaoh refused. And after plague after plague after plague, as God judged Pharaoh and the Egyptians, eventually Pharaoh said, go. And off they went. And they went, all of them, All of them God redeemed. None of them were left behind. And they were brought through to the Red Sea. And then you might remember how they came through the Red Sea as it parted side by side. And then the water came crashing down on the Egyptians which were following them. And in their mind at that time would have been this promise that God had said, I will redeem you and bring you to a land. Well, after the crossing of the Red Sea, Moses sings to the Lord. And Moses recognizes that God has kept this promise that he made before everything began. And in Exodus 15 and verse 13, Moses sings to the Lord and says, you in your mercy have led forth the people whom you have redeemed. God promised to redeem his people. And then Moses recognized that God has made good on that promise, that the people have been redeemed and they are no longer slaves to Egypt, but instead they are free. God redeemed his people as promised. Well, God then leads them through the desert to Mount Sinai. And there at Mount Sinai, he gives his law. And then we have after that, as he gives his law, we find this in Exodus chapter 20, that the people, upon hearing the word of God, come from God's mouth, that they are absolutely terrified. And they say to Moses, Moses, get God to speak to you, and then you can tell us what God says. And so this is what happens for the context of Leviticus. God is giving Moses his guidebook for a newly redeemed people. The people are newly redeemed. They've been slaves for almost 400 years. And God comes and tells them that as a redeemed people, this is how you must worship, serve, and obey me as your holy God. And so we come in Leviticus 25 and verse 25 to this idea of a kinsman redeemer. A kinsman redeemer reflects what God has done for his people. It's a representative of what God will do for them in the future. All mankind shares a great loss through our representative Adam. When Adam was there in the garden, he was the representative of all mankind. And there in the garden, we know that he lost for us our inheritance. Everything which God had set aside for Adam, there in the Garden of Eden, Adam lost it all. He brought sin into this world. And what has that sin done to us? While it promised to give us freedom, that we might be like God, well, no, that sin instead enslaves us. And we find now that living in a fallen world, that all mankind are slaves to sin. And being a slave to sin means that even when we want to do what is right, even when we want to do what is good, we find that sin is there, crouching at the door, and it seeks to have us, and that we are slaves to it. How often have you wanted to make sure that you've made the right decision, and then you look back on your day and you think, wow, there are so many times where I've messed up? Was because we're slaves of sin. It's because of Adam. Adam brought us into slavery. And so we see that Israel's enslavement to the Egyptians is a picture for us of the enslavement that we have under sin. And so the people, even though they've been redeemed from the Egyptians, they were still looking forward to a time where they might be redeemed from their sin. Romans chapter 5 and verse 14 tells us, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those who had not sinned according to the likeness of the transgression of Adam. So even those who had not been like Adam and sinned in his way, well, death continued to reign in them, because not only had they inherited Adam's sin, but there was their own sin, which cut them off from God. Sin had spread its way to us. The inheritance that Adam lost, well, we have lost that too. And his enslavement to sin has now been passed on to us. And so we, as sinners, we are slaves under sin. Just as God had promised redemption from Egypt to Israel, though, so he made a promise to Adam and Eve there in the garden. He said this, one day a Redeemer will come and he will buy back everything that you have lost. Can you see the picture which is happening here? That God talks of a kinsman redeemer, that if a man comes on bad times and he has to sell his land and his inheritance, or he has to sell himself even into slavery, that a close relative can come and redeem him back. Well, what had happened to Adam? Adam had lost his inheritance. He'd lost the Garden of Eden. And he'd also lost his own freedom as he became a slave to sin. But God says to Adam, one day someone is going to come who will redeem you, who will be able to buy back everything that you have lost today. Well, the rules for redemption are then laid down. Things must be done correctly if justice is not to be abused. A kinsman redeemer had a number of requirements that he had to fulfill. And this brings us to the book of Ruth. Now, the book of Ruth is a short book, only 4 chapters. You can read it in about 15 minutes. And in Ruth, we have a wonderful story of romantic love. And I'm sure that many of you who are sitting here this morning, that it is one of your favourites. That you come to the book of Ruth and you think, what a beautiful story. Ruth, this lovely young girl who follows after her mother-in-law, who goes through and finds Boaz. And you have that wonderfully romantic story where Boaz takes Ruth home and she is made his wife and she is added into the people of Israel. What a wonderful, beautiful story. Well, this beautiful story could easily have been forgotten to history. I'm sure there are many stories throughout Israel's times which were very similar. Things that happened which are lovely and romantic and bring us great joy. And yet many have been forgotten. And I'm sure that those long genealogies which the Bible has, I'm sure that many of those names, they are just a name now. But they would have had their own story just as you have your own story. But they are just a name there. But Ruth could easily have been forgotten to history as a name in a genealogy. And yet it's recorded in the Bible for us. Now, why is this story recorded in the Bible? Because it's not just a story. It's not just what a lovely story that will bring lots of joy to our children as we tell them it. No, at the very core of the book of Ruth is an example of the role of a kinsman redeemer. These few verses that we have in Leviticus tell us what the law was around what a kinsman redeemer is. But the book of Ruth takes this law of the kinsman redeemer and gives us a wonderful example of the sort of person a kinsman redeemer needed to be. In fact, we would say that Boaz encapsulates exactly the qualities a kinsman redeemer had to have. And therefore, Boaz typifies the coming Redeemer which had been promised. And the criteria that the Redeemer coming to redeem us from our slavery to sin, the criteria that was required for that Redeemer. Well, in Boaz's redemption of Ruth, we begin with great tragedy, as any story of a kinsman redeemer must. What do you need a kinsman redeemer for? Well, it's when you've lost everything. You've lost your inheritance, you've lost your land, you've lost even your freedom. And so we find that in the book of Ruth, we begin with great tragedy. Elimelech takes his wife and sons, and in a time of famine, he runs away from the land that God had given him. That land which God had given to his forefathers, that had come down to Elimelech, that Elimelech knew that this is the land of God, this is where God is king, because it is a time when Israel had no king and God was their king. Well, Elimelech, in seeing that times were tough and that the harvest had failed, he ran away. He saw that Moab seemed like a better place to raise his family from a worldly perspective. And so Elimelech went to the land of Moab, and there in the land of Moab, his 2 sons took wives of the Moabite people. Well, it wasn't long that they were in that land, and great tragedy befell them. Not just that they had left the land that God had given them, but that each of the men died. Elimelech and his 2 sons both died, and that left Naomi, Orpah and Ruth as widows. Now, in that time, it wasn't like today where we look after those who are less well off. No, in those days, the widows had no hope, really. There was a time where widows were not cared for. And Naomi, upon seeing God's judgment upon her family, those 3 boys of hers, her husband and her 2 sons, sees how they've died. She realizes that we have done a terrible thing. We have left the land of God, and I need to go back. And so she sees she must return. And yet Naomi, as she sees she must return, she sees no hope for herself. And she sees no hope for her daughters-in-laws. And so we see in the first chapter of Ruth that she blesses her daughters-in-law and she says, go back to your people, find new husbands who will look after you, because there is no hope for you if you come with me. Even if I was to find someone who I could have a child with in my old age, would you wait until they were grown up? Well, she blesses her daughters-in-laws. She advises them to return. And in great sorrow and grief, she says, there is no hope. And so Orpah returns upon this, but Ruth perseveres. Ruth perseveres and says, where you go, I will go. And most wonderfully, what she says is, your God will be my God. And so they return to the land of Israel. They come back to Bethlehem. And there, Naomi is recognized. They say, Naomi's returned. And they see the great tragedy that has befallen her. But this is what she says to them. And she says this in chapter 1 and verse 20. Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. I've nothing left. Don't call me Naomi, but call me Mara, which means bitter. She saw no hope. And there she was with her daughter-in-law, and she fully expected that she had come home to die. There was nothing left for her. There was no hope. Ruth chapter 2 paints this picture of Naomi, who is sitting at home absolutely hopeless. She cannot see any way out. And yet Ruth trusts in the Lord. And Ruth goes out, and there was a wonderful law which God had given for the poor and desolate, that even though it was a time where widows were not looked after, that you could go out to the fields and you could glean from what was dropped. And so Ruth, upon hearing that this was a wonderful law that God had given, she decides to go out and gather food for Naomi. And she finds herself in the field of Boaz. Well, when Ruth returns home, she has so much barley that Naomi is shocked. When you used to go out by this law, you might be able to pick up enough to maybe have a loaf of bread between you. And yet Ruth came back with such a rich harvest from gleaning in the fields that Naomi is reminded that God has made a way that the destitute might be restored. She realizes that God is still looking after them. And when she hears that Ruth, the field that she just so happened to go to was the field of Boaz, she remembered of a kinsman redeemer. She says this in chapter 2 and verse 20. We see in chapter 1 verse 20, she's very bitter. She comes back, she says, call me Mara, I have no hope. Well, in chapter 2 and verse 20, we read this. This is Naomi. Blessed be he, that is Boaz, of the Lord, who has not forsaken his kindness to the living and the dead. This man is a relation of ours, one of our close relatives. Now to Ruth, this might not have meant much, but to Naomi, she had been given hope. She was reminded that God could redeem everything that she's lost, that God could redeem them. It was not just that Boaz might be kind to Ruth because that he was close family, but that he might fulfill the role of kinsman redeemer. And in Ruth 3, we see Naomi plan how Ruth might be redeemed and share in the inheritance of Israel. Naomi realizes there is a way back. There is hope. I could have everything back which I lost. Well, Ruth has nothing to offer Boaz. She's a refugee. She's a foreigner. She is empty-handed. In fact, this is the exact reason that a closer relative chooses to forego taking ownership of the land and inheritance, because Ruth was not valuable. Ruth would spoil his inheritance. If he had to look after Ruth as well, what does she add to me? She adds to me nothing. So Ruth has nothing to offer Boaz. However, we find that Boaz views Ruth as a Proverbs 31 virtuous woman. He sees Ruth and he says, "You have great value." Boaz tells her this at the end of chapter 3, "I will perform the duty for you as the Lord lives." Boaz, in seeing that Ruth had come to ask him, "Will you redeem me? Will you be my kinsman redeemer?" that Boaz sees this as his duty. And he says, "Go home, bring some food, tell Naomi, I am going to sort everything out." And as Ruth goes back to Naomi, Naomi says this, "The man will not rest until he has concluded the matter this day." He had great hope again. A kinsman redeemer, we are going to be redeemed. And they were sitting home with great anticipation. Well, we read together what happened next, didn't we? In Ruth chapter 4, which we read, Boaz gathered the elders. He presented his case. He showed himself to be the only man possible to fulfill the role of kinsman redeemer. And then Ruth is redeemed in the eyes of all the people. This bitter old lady who'd come back, Naomi who'd come back, the women then come and say, in seeing how God has shown them how a kinsman redeemer should work, they say, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a close relative, and may his name be famous in Israel." That's verse 14. The women see that what God has done is very gracious to Naomi. It's not because Naomi deserved it. She lost everything. Her inheritance had been ruined. She had nothing. And yet she had been redeemed by a close relative. Ruth comes from a family who have turned their backs on God and lost it all. But through Boaz, their kinsman redeemer, all is restored. And they are blessed not just to have land and to be part of God's people, but they're blessed in such a way that they get to be part of the genealogy of Jesus. In fact, Boaz and Ruth are the great grandparents of David himself, the greatest king which Israel ever had. This Moabite woman, who is outside the place of God's people, had been redeemed in such a way that she was brought into the genealogy of Christ, and that her children's children was the great king of Israel. Boaz redeems himself a bride, and therefore he foreshadows Christ, who takes on the role of our kinsman redeemer. And he redeems himself a bride as well. Who is the bride which Christ redeems himself? He redeems himself, the church. That if you are part of God's family, that you are Christ's bride. We read in the New Testament, he will be named Jesus. This is what the angel says to Mary, that he will be named Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. In fact, just as Moses acknowledged God's redemption for Israel, Zechariah prophesies this in Luke 1:68. "Blessed is the Lord God of Israel, for he has visited and redeemed his people." Redemption was what was on the mind of the people. They knew their sin. They knew that they were enslaved by it. But they knew that God had promised that a Redeemer would come. The promised kinsman Redeemer has come. Isaiah prophesied in 54 verse 5, "For your Maker is your husband, the Lord of hosts is his name, and your Redeemer is the Holy One of Israel. He is called the God of the whole earth." And one who looked forward, the kinsman Redeemer is one who Job looked forward to as well. And in Job 19 verse 25, Job proclaims this, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and he shall stand at last on the earth." The Redeemer is coming, and Zechariah realizes the Redeemer is here. How wonderful. The point that's being made is that a kinsman Redeemer was required, as in Adam the land and the inheritance had become lost, and the people, all mankind, had become slaves of sin. Therefore, they needed to be restored, both their land and their freedom. And Boaz typifies what the Redeemer must be like and what criteria they must fulfill. In fact, Boaz's redemption of Ruth gives us 4 key requirements that a kinsman Redeemer needs to be. Here are the 4, and then we're going to look at them in a little bit more depth and how Christ fulfills those 4 things. So a kinsman Redeemer, firstly, had to be kin. They had to be a close relative. Secondly, they had to be willing. Thirdly, they had to be able. And fourthly, they had to pay the price in full. So they had to be kin, they had to be willing, they had to be able, they had to pay the price. So firstly, a kinsman Redeemer had to be kin. There had to be a close relational tie. Someone from another family could not redeem because they did not have that tie to the man who needed redemption. Okay? You couldn't just say, "Oh, he's a good friend of mine, I'll redeem his land." Well, no, he'd sold it already to somebody else. And you couldn't just say, "Well, I'll redeem that land because I've got a good friendship with them." No, the role of a kinsman redeemer was that the land would stay with those whose inheritance it was. And so they had to have a close relational tie. Otherwise, anyone could come and claim the land or the person. Well, in Boaz's case, we see that there's a closer relative, and so he had to defer to him first. It had to be the closest relational tie. Well, this is a key point for Christ in his incarnation. Christ had to be the same kind as us in order to redeem. We read in John chapter 1 and verse 1 that Jesus is God. Jesus is God, and while that is a wonderful truth, therein lies a problem. Jesus being God meant he was not the same as us, and therefore justice could not be fulfilled if Jesus was to come as God and save us. Okay? Jesus was not the same kind as us. He was not a relation, because he was God and we are man. And so if Jesus did not take on humanity, there would be no way for redemption for us. Since sin came into the world through one man, it would take another man to bring salvation. Romans chapter 5 verse 18 tells us, "For as by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so also by one man's obedience many will be made righteous." It couldn't be one man brought us into sin, so God brought us out of sin. No, that wasn't just. That wasn't how it was set that it could be. A man had to bring us out. A man brought us into sin. A man has to bring us out. This would require then the infinite God to take on human flesh. And this is what John tells us in the same chapter. In chapter 1 verse 1 he says, Jesus is God. And in verse 14 he tells us, God became flesh and dwelt among us. Why did Jesus need to come into this world and take on flesh? Why did he have to become a human man? Well, because that was the only way that justly we could be redeemed. The incarnation tells us that God became man. In fact, Joseph is reminded of the prophecy by the angel. When he finds that Mary is pregnant, he's reminded of this prophecy. They shall call his name Emmanuel, which is translated God with us. Well, Philippians 2 verse 7 to 8 tells us that Jesus came in the likeness of men, and being found in the appearance as a man, he humbled himself. Well, this is of vital importance for our redemption. Jesus had to come as a man. If he was not our kin, he could not become our kinsman redeemer. If he was not a close relation, he could not redeem us. In fact, Galatians 4 says, "But when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons." For the law to be followed, which is of necessity because God is wholly just, Jesus had to be fully human to redeem us. Born under the law of God, all humans are guilty of breaking that law. Only a perfect human, Jesus Christ, could perfectly keep the law and perfectly fulfill the law and thereby redeem us. 2 Corinthians 5 verse 21 says, "For he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him." There was no other way. And so we have the Immaculate Conception, God born as a child to take away our sin. The first requirement of a kinsman redeemer is that they were closely related. And so Jesus had to take on human form that he might be closely related to each one of us here. Well, secondly, we find that a kinsman redeemer had to be willing to redeem the person who was lost. It was no passive obligation, but it was a binding together. It was not just a one and done, I've redeemed you, I've paid the price, it's fine. No, you as the kinsman redeemer were binding yourself to this person. And so you had to be willing to do that. It was not something that might be forced. It was not that someone might come. In fact, there's a whole passage in, I believe it's Deuteronomy chapter 25, of what happens if someone will not be a kinsman redeemer. If no one will step up and take on that obligation, how it is that it's to proceed. So there was not a forcing of a kinsman redeemer. This is the criteria here, that they needed to be willing. This was the criteria that ruled Ruth's closer relative out, because he was not willing to be the kinsman redeemer. Because while he happily would have redeemed the land and taken that as part of his inheritance, he did not want Ruth to be a partaker in what he already had. In chapter 4 verse 6 he says to Boaz, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I ruin my own inheritance." He did not want to bring Ruth in as part of his inheritance. And so he said, I can't be the kinsman redeemer. Why? Because a kinsman redeemer had to be willing. If he had redeemed Ruth, she would forever have been part of his family and have access to all the privileges that being in his family would have. And so he rules himself out. And he says to Boaz, I am not willing. And therefore, you can be the kinsman redeemer. The obligation of being kinsman redeemer then could not be forced. Being willing is at the heart of what a kinsman redeemer must be. We see in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 7 to 8, Jesus made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant and coming in the likeness of men. And being found as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death of the cross. Jesus gave up his life as a sacrifice of his own free will. This is vitally important. To redeem someone, it needs to be your choice. The Father did not force the Son to do it. He did not force him through. Nobody forced Jesus. Jesus himself said, I will redeem. I am willing. Do you remember that story when the leper came and said, if you are willing, you can make me well? And what did Jesus say? I am willing. Well, we are afflicted with sin, and we say to the Lord Jesus, Jesus, if you are willing, you can redeem me. And Jesus says, I am willing. We see him in the garden praying this, not my will, but yours be done. Jesus was willing to do God's will. And yet again, we read in John chapter 10, I lay down my life that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of myself. He was fully willing. He knew what was coming ahead. He knew what the death on the cross would be. He knew he was about to experience the wrath of God and the punishment for sin. And Jesus said, I am willing. No one twisted his arm to do it. Jesus was willing to be obedient and see this process all the way through to the very end. When we read in John chapter 3 verse 16 that he gave his only begotten son, this was not the son being forced into saving the world begrudgingly, but that the son also was willing. He'd made an agreement with the Father before the earth began that he would do all that is necessary for us to be saved. We read that in Ephesians chapter 1, didn't we? That Jesus agreed to be our Saviour before the very foundations of the earth. In fact, we would go as far as saying that Christ is more willing to save than sinners are willing to be saved by him. Christ was more willing to go to the cross than we are. And Christ went to the cross to die and receive the punishment for sin. And yet we go to the cross to receive salvation. There's no punishment there in the cross. It's just a humbling of ourselves and saying, Jesus, please save me. And yet we find Jesus was more willing to go to the cross than we are. When we see the example of Boaz and how he fought for Ruth, the undesirable foreigner, and we smile at the love that Boaz had for her, we must see who he represented. Jesus came willingly for us. We read in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 2 that as we look to Jesus, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame. That as he looked forward to the cross, he looked past the cross to us, who would be redeemed. And he saw us at great joy, just as everyone looked at Ruth and said, absolutely undesirable. Nothing in her is worth anything. And yet Boaz looked at her and loved her. Well, likewise, Jesus looks at us and he says, I am willing to die on a cross and endure the wrath of God to redeem this people. Just as it was joy for Boaz to fight for and claim Ruth as his bride, redeeming her and joining himself to her totally, so it was for Jesus, who did all that he had to do for the joy of redeeming us. He endured the wrath of God that he might redeem us, and in seeing us as his prize, he did it willingly and joyfully. He fulfills totally what a kinsman redeemer had to be, willing to redeem. Well, thirdly, a kinsman redeemer had to be able to redeem. Being a close relative and being willing was not enough to redeem someone. You actually had to be able to follow through with the redemption. If you did not have the financial means to make the redemption, then you could not be the kinsman redeemer. It did not matter how good your intentions were or how much you wanted to do it. If you did not have the means to pay, you would not be able to redeem. Well, the price of redemption was high. Boaz had to buy back the field at the cost that it was. Naomi and Elimelech, in the time when there'd been no harvest and there was a famine, they probably sold that field for pittance, for next to nothing. But Boaz had to pay for that field in harvest, where it would have been most expensive. And Boaz had to pay that full price. He also, it tells us, when we look at the rules in Leviticus 25, it tells us that depending on how many years it was until the year of Jubilee, you had to pay a price for each of those years as well, because you're taking away future harvest time. And so the price of redeeming was quite high. I'm redeeming the cost of the field now and its future earnings up to the year of Jubilee. And so the price was high. Boaz, fortunately, was a well-off man. He had the means to pay. And that very day, all the debt was paid and Ruth was fully redeemed. Well, our price of redemption was also very high. Our sin has cut us off from God. And what do we read are the wages of sin? Well, we know it, don't we? The wages of sin is death. That is the price that needed to be paid. So what is the price to redeem us as a people? Well, the price is death. Well, what higher price is that? The cost of redemption is too high for any man to pay. Because when we talk about the wages of sin being death, we're not talking about someone laying down their life and dying like you see in heroic action movies, that someone jumps in front of the way and say, well, that is not what death is. When it's talking about death here, it's talking about eternal death. It's talking about the wrath of God in hell. A death which is beyond our comprehension. The cost of our redemption was too high for any man to pay. We each have our own debt of sin. And so we see this, that Christ had to be perfect. In order to pay that debt, he had to be perfect, so he had none of his own sin to pay for. Christ had to be obedient to the law for his redemption to be valid. And so he tells his followers, do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. It was Adam's disobedience which brought us into debt and made us sinners. And so it was by Jesus' obedience that many will be made righteous, we read in Romans. It had to be total. He had to fulfill every law given. And this makes Satan's tempting in the wilderness make so much more sense, doesn't it? If Jesus even made the slightest misstep, then he could not redeem us. He could not be our kinsman redeemer. Well, how was it that Jesus was able to be our kinsman redeemer? How was it that he was able to keep the whole law of God? Well, it's because he was not merely a man. No, while Jesus was 100% fully man, he was also fully God. His humanity was underpinned by his deity, which shone through. And we see it as we read the Gospels, that we're not just reading the good news of a man who was the best of us. We aren't just reading heroic deeds and wonderful things which this man long a time lived. No, as we read the Gospel, we see his deity shine through, whether that's in his miracles, or in his teachings, or in his transformation on the Mount. Jesus is God. He's got two natures in one body. And this makes him able to pay the price of sin. This makes him able to pay the wages of sin, which is death. He is able to die on that cross because of the underpinning of his deity, underpinning his humanity. Our pastor has often in the past liked to use the analogy of reinforced concrete. Concrete, if you have a concrete bridge, then it will collapse. Okay, concrete, while it's very hard and very strong, if you put that pressure on it, it will break. Okay, and so what they have to do is they have to reinforce the concrete with steel beams. And if you have the steel beams in the concrete won't break. And then you can have many lorries go over that bridge and it isn't going to break apart. Well, Christ's humanity is underpinned in a similar way. The strength comes from his deity. This enables him to take hold of the weight no man could, the weight of sin. the wages of sin is death. And so Christ has to be able to die for us to be able to pay this great debt that we have accrued. A kinsman redeemer has to be able to pay the debt. And we see in Christ that because of his deity, he only is able to pay the price. Well, finally, one last thing that a kinsman redeemer had to be. A kinsman redeemer didn't just have to be kin, didn't just have to be willing, he didn't just have to be able. A kinsman redeemer had to pay the price in full. It was not good enough just that he was a family member and he was willing and he had the means. No, he also had to pay the price. There was no such thing as a partial redemption, because if there was, Ruth's closer relative would have said, well, I'll buy the land, but I won't buy Ruth. Well, no, there's no such thing in there as a partial redemption. If the obligation of the kinsman redeemer was not just to redeem the land, but to redeem the whole thing, including the person. They had to pay the full price. Unless the full price was paid, there was no redemption. It truly was all or nothing. And we see this in Boaz's case, that the closer relative would have happily redeemed the land, but not Ruth. And so he was disqualified. And so Boaz tells the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought all that was Elimelech's and acquired Ruth as my wife. Boaz paid everything that was necessary that day, and that very day Ruth was redeemed and had part in the inheritance. Well, Christ too, as our kinsman redeemer, had to pay the price. It was not enough that he was willing. It was not enough that he was able to do it. He had to go through with it. It was not an easy task to be taken lightly. We see him in the garden, knowing what is before him, sweating blood, because he is under so much stress of what is to come. He knew what was before him. He asked God, is there any other way? And yet we also see in his arrest, in his trial, in his hanging on the cross, in his beatings, in his crucifixion, we see that he did what was required. This is a man who is able and willing to pay the price, and he does it. At no point, we must make clear, at no point did it just get away from him. There was no point where he could have, there's no point where he couldn't have stopped the payment. We hear that he could have escaped the garden. He'd done it many times before. How many times had the Jews lifted up rocks ready to stone him and he just slipped away? Well, he could have done the same in the garden. He could have just slipped away if he wasn't willing to go through with the payment. As he stood before Pilate, he didn't open his mouth. He could have defended himself and said, Pilate, this is clearly unjust. There's nothing they've got against me. And yet he kept his mouth quiet because he was willing to go through with the payment. Even when he was hanging on the cross, it was that he could have called down a legion of angels to rescue him. There was no point where he could have said, well, I've got to make the payment now, I've got no choice. No, he had a choice at every point. He could have stopped the payment, and yet he went through with it. He endured everything and made the payment. He made the payment in full. And we know this because 3 days later, he rose from the dead, which tells us this: the payment was accepted. Titus 2 and verse 14 tells us Jesus Christ, who gave himself for us, that he might redeem us from every lawless deed and purify for himself his own special people, zealous for good works. This is the beautiful thing about redemption. It is a complete redemption. There is nothing more to pay. And you will find in many of the cults and many of the other churches that they might tell you that there is still something that you need to do. You've got certain works to make, or you've got to try and live a good life. The Bible tells us that that's not the case. The Bible tells us that what Christ did on the cross was a complete payment. When Boaz redeemed Ruth and the land, he had to make the payment in full. He couldn't put a payment plan and say, well, I'll pay you this much each month. No, Boaz had to make the payment in full. And likewise, Christ on the cross made the payment in full. Every lawless deed, every sin has been purged, past, present and future. There is no more debt. We are free men. Well, like Ruth, we had no hope. We were in a lost, sinful condition. Our status was desperate and destitute. We were in great need of a kinsman redeemer. Boaz redeemed Ruth, and she was grafted into Israel, part of the genealogy of Christ, and the people were witnesses of the legitimacy. Think of how Ruth and how she must have felt. Boaz told her, I am going to sort everything out. And Naomi said, wait and see. And then she saw her kinsman redeemer do all that he promised, that Israel was now her home. Everyone had witnessed her legitimacy and were able to call her sister. Her inheritance was accomplished that day, and she never had to doubt her freedom or her future. Ruth was fully redeemed. You can imagine the story of when people came to Bethlehem and they met Boaz and Ruth and they said, oh, you're such a lovely couple. How did you meet? I reckon it was Ruth who took the foreground and said, listen to what Boaz did for me. Listen about how he redeemed me and how I am free. I was born in Moab. I was raised there. But Boaz redeemed me, and now I'm one of God's people. Can you imagine being there as Ruth, with tears in her eyes, said, look what Boaz did for me. He sorted everything. Well, for us, Christ redeemed us. We were grafted into the family of God, and now we have an inheritance waiting for us in heaven above. We lost everything in Adam and by our own sin, but Jesus stepped in. He paid the redemption price, and he has given us a new identity. And this is what a kinsman redeemer is. This is what we have in Christ. We were lost, but we have been restored because Jesus redeemed us. The beautiful thing is that we never have to worry about being redeemed again. Jesus has paid the price of redemption once and for all. And as we turn to Ephesians 1, let us see what redemption has accomplished. In Ephesians chapter 1, we've read it already today, but he gained for us every spiritual blessing. He chose us and made us without blame before him in love. It tells us verse 4 to 5. In verse 7 of Ephesians 1, it says, in him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins according to the riches of his grace. In verse 11, it says, in him also we have obtained an inheritance. We can trust him and believe him because we have been sealed with the Holy Spirit of promise, who is the guarantee of our inheritance until the redemption of the purchased possession to the praise of his glory. Verse 14. Well, the promises in Ephesians chapter 1 map out for us that we can have the same confidence as Ruth she had on the day of her redemption. When we have been redeemed, when we give our lives over to the Lord Jesus Christ, on that very day, everything is paid. We don't have to doubt it. Heaven is already paid. It's not something that we will own in the future. We already own heaven. We are already ambassadors from there. That is our home now, just as Israel was Ruth's home. The inheritance is ours. The redemption is complete, and we can be fully confident. What a wonderful kinsman redeemer we have. And as Ephesians 1 goes on in verse 18 and 19, may we have wisdom and knowledge and hope in the riches of the glory of his inheritance in the saints, and what is the exceeding greatness of his power towards us who believe, according to the working of his mighty power. Christian, you can look to Christ and say, he is my Redeemer. He has paid everything, and I am going to heaven. That is the confidence you can have. And if you are not a Christian, notice this, that in Adam, you have lost everything. You've lost all your inheritance. You have lost your very freedom to sin. but Jesus is willing to be your kinsman redeemer. And if you ask him, just as Ruth asked Boaz, if you ask him to redeem you, that Jesus says, I am willing. Won't you go to him? Amen.